So the skull. So external skull. You could see the anterior by the orbits, of course, and the nasal cavity and the top teeth. Okay, so take a look at your skull, see if you can see what the front is. Anterior. And now, of course, the eyes aren't there, so you could see the bones in the posterior orbit, which are pretty difficult. But let's keep it simple now. Probably the first thing you should know, hopefully you can see this on the video, is anterior, and I can take the skull cap off and look at it this way. It's a little bright. So the anterior part of the skull, like if I put this on a table and said which is anterior and which is posterior, the anterior is more tapered and it's thicker in the back. And then you look at the stitching on the skull, right? You see that? Those are sutures, immovable joints, right? Fibrous joint that really don't move. So if you look at the anterior, you could see the suture that's across the anterior, and that's called the coronal suture. Coronal suture. So the bone in the front is called the frontal bone. So frontal bone, coronal suture, right here. And then behind the frontal bone, you have two paired bones. So you'd have the left and right parietal bone. And you see there's a suture that separates those? So the suture that separates the two parietal bones is called the sagittal suture. Makes sense, right? That mid-sagittal. Two T's on that. So when you do the practical, like this, even this practical, put two T's and it'll mark you right. Then I don't have to do it. So posterior, now this is the back of the skull. Again, if I had this here, you'd be looking at a larger bone, of course. So the back of the skull, the bone here is the occipital bone. And the suture that separates the parietal bones from the occipital bones, this long suture is called lambdoid suture. Okay? So we named 3 bones so far, and they go along with the lobes of the brain. So they're protecting the cerebrum, actually the cerebral lobes. So anterior, frontal bone, and that comes down to here too. Frontal bone, separated from the parietal bones by the coronal suture. 2 parietal bones, left and right, separated by the sagittal suture. Posterior, you have the lambdoid suture separating the 2 parietal bones, right and left, from the occipital bone. Okay? So there's one more cranial bone that we need to see. And that's actually there's 2, but this is a bigger one. This one is the temporal bone. All of this is temporal bone. All of this in here. And the suture that separates the temporal bone from the parietal bone and the occipital bone and the frontal bone, basically, is called the squamosal suture or squamous suture, like the epithelium, right? And then on the other side, you have the left version of that. This is all temporal bone from here to here, here, up to the squamosal suture, temporal bone. So let's repeat again. Anterior, you have the frontal bone. All of this is frontal bone. Behind the frontal bone, you have the coronal suture, separating the frontal bone from the right and left parietal bone. The parietal bones are separated by the sagittal suture. Posterior, you have the occipital bone, and that's separated from the parietal bones by the lambdoid suture. Lateral, another paired set of bones. The temporal bone, all of this, is temporal bone, all of this. And the suture that separates the temporal bone from the parietal bone and the occipital bone is called squamous suture or squamosal suture, both sides. And now there's one more bone, and it's right towards the orbit. And you can see all these bones have separations, right, like red markings, so it helps you. So there's a small bone that goes deep into the skull called the sphenoid bone. That's part of the sphenoid bone, S-P-H-N-O-I-D, and that's paired as well. On the other side, sphenoid bone. Understood? Okay, good. So looking at the front, more things to look at. I'm just going to take this off for now, and you can see how the sutures are drawn out on the inferior surface of the skull cap. So looking anterior, and this is where it gets a little dicey now. First of all, the mandible is disarticulated on this skull. There's no mandible. Everybody understand that? And if you look at your articulated skeleton, you can see where that articulates, the mandible on the skinny guy next to you. Take a look at that, the mandible, so you see where that's going in. Okay? So I'm going to start at the bottom. And you can see the teeth. I'm not interested in teeth, but the bone that's right above the upper teeth is called the maxilla. So this margin is called the alveolar margin of the maxilla. So alveolar means related to the teeth, right? The bones, right? The enameled teeth, which have joints going into the maxilla. So the margin is called alveolar margin. Okay, the cheekbone up here, the cheekbone is called the zygomatic bone on both sides, right? So know it's paired. Okay? And now the zygomatic bone, let's look lateral. Okay, this is a really important part right here. The zygomatic bone has a process going posterior. And right here, there's a connection between the temporal bone and the zygomatic bone. So this is temporal bone right here. And this process is called the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, and that stops here. Technically, this would be the temporal process of the zygomatic bone, and it forms an arch. If you look here, you can see an arch right here where this is the temporal part, this is the zygomatic. So this is the temporal bone, so we call it the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. And this is the zygomatic bone right here. So now the nasal cavity has two parts in its dead center. And if you've heard of the word septum, which separates two compartments, sometimes it's a membrane septum. In this case, it's all bone. So now this is a little difficult, but this is what I'm going to ask you. The bottom part, just the bottom part, from here down, all this, is called the vomer. V-O-M-E-R. And that means plow. So if you look into the skull later, you're going to see that that kind of looks like a plow pushing forward. So that's the vomer. It's its own bone, and it's not paired. Dead center. Making up the lower nasal septum. Now the one above, that piece above, that's actually part of a bone called the ethmoid bone. E-T-H-M-O-I-D. So the ethmoid bone, again, goes deeper into the cranium, and we call this the perpendicular plate of ethmoid. So the top part, the superior part of the septum, is called the perpendicular plate of ethmoid. The bottom part is the vomer. So here's the nasal cavity. And you have these little turbinates inside, and they're covered with membranes, producing mucus, right? Some cilia, warming the air as they come in. So these bones are called the nasal concha, like the conch shell. And there's an inferior nasal concha and a middle nasal concha. You really can't see all of them. So on the practical, once I point to one of these turbinates in here, you're going to say nasal concha, okay? And above the nasal cavity, you have two bones, actually, paired bones. one on the left, one on the right. And this is where you put your glasses, right? You put the middle part of your glasses. And those are called nasal bones. Nasal bones. And that's dead center. So now it gets difficult. Hopefully you can see this on the recording. So the nasal bone is medial. Just lateral to the nasal bone is maxilla, actually. This is still part of the maxilla. All of this is maxilla. Here's the alveolar margin. Here's maxilla right there. Same thing on the other side. This is maxilla. Just lateral to the nasal bone. And then the next bone over, or to the middle, let's see if you see a better look on this side. If you look in a little deeper, there's a small bone just lateral to the maxilla. And this is called the lacrimal bone. And it's on both sides. Lacrimal bone. Lacrimal is tears. So there should be a tear duct going to the throat from here to the pharynx. Or nasal cavity first, the nasopharynx. So again, nasal bone, maxilla, and then you have the lacrimal bone. This is zygomatic, maxilla. And then if you look even deeper in, lateral to the lacrimal bone is part of the ethmoid bone. And that's on both sides. So let's do it on this side. So medial to lateral, nasal bone, maxilla, lacrimal bone, and ethmoid bone. Then if you look on the lateral part of the socket, which we call the orbit or the socket, this is still zygomatic here, but back here you have what's called the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. And you see holes in there, which I'll go over the holes later. Let's just go through the bones. And it's on both sides. You can see the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. And don't forget, this is the frontal bone. Okay? So, looking at the bottom of the skull, now you're going to see a lot of foramen. So let's do the easiest one first. The easiest one is the foramen magnum. That's big hole, right? This hole right here is the foramen magnum. So your brain stem is going to end there and starting your spinal cord just below the foramen magnum. So there's a lot of parts to see here, so we'll go through this a little bit slow. So just next to the foramen magnum, you have these articular surfaces that are going to articulate with the first cervical vertebrae. And they're like little slippers. These are the occipital condyles, just adjacent to the foramen magnum. Okay? And let's do the holes while we're here. Okay, so the way these work, and you could learn a mnemonic for them and go through it that way, but they're pretty difficult. So just under here, you have kind of like oblong foramen. And these are called the jugular foramen, or jugular foramina. Remember, you're looking at inferior skull, jugular foramen. And just above that, you're going to have what's called the carotid canals. So if you said carotid foramen, I'd be okay with it. Carotid canals. Then you have, and they don't show them all actually. This one up here is called the foramen lacerum. I'll go through these again. Foramen lacerum, and this is the foramen ovale, in that order. Okay, and there's also another little foramen here called the foramen spinosum, which doesn't look perfect on every skull. So that's a lot. That's a lot. So let's do it again. Right here, you have the foramen magnum. These are the jugular foramen. These are the carotid canals. This would be your foramen spinosum. This would be your foramen lacerum. and this is your foramen ovale. So ovale, lacerum, spinosum, carotid canal, and foramen magnum and jugular foramen. Okay, and then if you turn it over, now you're looking at the bottom of the skull, the nut bowl of the skull, and there's a lot of things to see here. So here you have the foramen again. Now you don't see the carotid canal here. This, again, foramen magnum, you could see. You could see the jugular foramen. You could see the foramen spinosum. You could see the foramen lacerum. And you could put your, like a pencil or something, try not to draw on them, but you could put something through here to see where they come out, to see that you know that foramen. And then you have your foramen ovale. And there's another foramen up here, it's hard to see, called the foramen rotundum. This is one you didn't meet yet. The foramen rotundum you see only from this view, looking down from the superior to inferior. You don't see that on this view. This one you only see the carotid canals on these skulls. And these skulls are not perfect, of course. Okay? Some other things you need to look for here. This is the petrous portion of the temporal bone. This is all temporal bone. So there's a canal in there. Really, we call it a meatus. So this is the opening for the internal acoustic meatus, coming in from the ear, right? The nerve. And if you look at it over here in the temporal bone, you can see the external acoustic meatus. Both sides, of course. So internal and external acoustic meatus. Now you have some fun stuff on top. Now this is still frontal bone. See how it tapers? This is anterior. So this is frontal bone. That's magnetic. That's cool. And all this in here is your ethmoid bone. So pay attention to these two things. It's always on the practical. So if you see and feel, you could feel it. There's a bump right in the middle, like a little knife-like structure. And that's called the crista galli of the ethmoid bone. And right to the side of them, to the sides of the crista galli are plates that have foramina in it for your olfactory receptors. So these two plates are called cribriform plate of ethmoid. Okay, so that's anterior, superior in the skull, of course. So that's related to these nasal concha from the front. That's where your smell receptors, olfaction. So the olfactory bulbs will sit right here and then proceed backwards to the temporal lobe of the cerebrum. Then you have this large bone in here, and it looks like a butterfly. All of this is like a butterfly. And that's your sphenoid bone. And you have a lesser wing of sphenoid bone, and this is the greater wing of sphenoid bone. These are called the pterygoid processes. It begins with a P. PT, right? Pterygoid, you see that? So again, ethmoid bone, crista galli, with the two cribriform plates. Let's call it cribriform plates, but it's really one piece. Then they have foramina in it. So the sphenoid has the lesser wing and the greater wing. And later on, you're going to see that the optic canal is part of the lesser wing of sphenoid. Now this little saddle here is going to house the pituitary gland. So this saddle is a cute name. It's called the sella turcica of sphenoid bone. The canal is actually called the hypophyseal canal because another name for the pituitary gland is the hypophysis. So this is the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. Okay? And then you have your occipital bone, you have your anterior cavity, your middle cavity, and your posterior cavity. I won't really ask you that because you have enough to worry about with ethmoid, sphenoid, and the temporal parts. So if you go back to the front and you look deep in here, it's hard to see. There's a hole right in the lesser wing of sphenoid called the optic canal. It's a hole, right? It's called optic canal for cranial nerve 2. Now there's a slit on both sides too, and that's your supraorbital fissure or superior orbital fissure. I'll take both. Your book may say different, right? So that's the fissure because it's like a crevice. So a fissure is like a long hole, oblong hole. And there's an inferior orbital fissure as well. But don't forget the optic canal is a hole back in the sphenoid bone, lesser wing of sphenoid. You kind of see it there. Superior orbital fissure, inferior orbital fissure, superior orbital fissure, inferior orbital fissure. I don't care if you say supraorbital or superior. It means the same thing to me. And you also have some foramen in the maxilla. And these are called your infraorbital foramen. And these would be your supraorbital foramen. So that's a lot of foramen. It's a big list, but I'll go through it with you all. I'll go through and make sure that at least you could see it close up. Big help. So a few more parts of the temporal bone. Temporal bone has the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. And this is the petrous portion of the temporal bone where it's very thick. This right here, and you could feel this on your own skulls, this is called the mastoid process of the temporal bone. And this pointy thing is called the styloid process of the temporal bone. And here's the external acoustic meatus. And there's a foramen between called the stylomastoid foramen. That's on both sides. So remember, this is all temporal bone. Zygomatic process of temporal bone, mastoid process of temporal bone, styloid process of temporal bone, external acoustic meatus, and the stylomastoid foramen. And right here is where the mandible is going to articulate to form the temporomandibular joint. So there's a fossa there, a temporomandibular fossa. It's really mandibular fossa is what it's called. So again, use the foramen magnum as a start. There's also foramen, which you really can't see on this skull, inside the walls of the foramen magnum, and that's called the hypoglossal canal, which will house the hypoglossal nerve, cranial nerve 12. Glossal means tongue. So again, make it simple. Go through the cranial bones, frontal bone, parietal bones, occipital bone, temporal bone, sphenoid bone, and then the facial bones like the nasal bone, the maxilla, all this is maxilla, the lacrimal bone, the ethmoid bone, the greater wing of sphenoid bone, the vomer, perpendicular plate of ethmoid, nasal concha, alveolar margin of the maxilla, and then your foramen magnum, occipital condyles, hypoglossal canal, your jugular foramen, your carotid canal, your foramen lacerum, foramen spinosum, foramen ovale, right? Then you have your palatine bone in here, palatine bone, which has foramen too, okay? And that's your hard palate, because of course there's no soft palate there. Posterior vomer, perpendicular plate of ethmoid. So this is the palatine process of the ethmoid bone, and this is the palatine bone that has a foramen called incisive foramen, named after the teeth. Okay?